Welcome to Building the Future, Freedom, Prosperity, and Foreign Policy, a podcast series focused on updating the United States soft power playbook to meet the hopes and aspirations of developing countries because it's in America's interest to do so. I'm Dan Runde, Senior Vice President at CSIS. There are a lot of global challenges out there, so let's get started. Hello and welcome back to another episode of Building the Future with Dan Runde. Today, I'm joined by Judge Mark Wolf, the chair of Integrity Initiatives International. He's a senior United States District Judge and the former Chief Judge of the United States District Court for the District of Massachusetts. Prior to his judicial appointment in 1985, Judge Wolf served as a special assistant to the Attorney General of the United States after Watergate and as the Deputy United States Attorney for the District of Massachusetts. In a 2011 editorial, The Judge Who Cracked the Bulger Case, the New York Times commended Judge Wolf for exposing the corrupt relationship between the FBI and its top echelon organized crime informant, James Whitey Bulger. Judge Wolf is a graduate of Yale College and Harvard Law School and has served as an adjunct lecturer in public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School, where he taught a seminar on combating corruption internationally. In addition, Judge Wolf was a senior fellow of the Harvard Carr Center for Human Rights. He is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and was a non-resident fellow of the Woodrow Wilson Center. In 2014, Judge Wolf published an article through the Brookings Institution and a Washington Post op-ed piece advocating the creation of an International AntiCorruption Court to combat the abuse of public office for private gain by a nation's leaders. There is now a rapidly progressing campaign to create the International AntiCorruption Court, which is supported by more than 300 world leaders, more than 100 civil society organizations, the European Parliament, the Netherlands, Canada, and other countries. So I'm podcasting Judge Wolf today to discuss his judicial career and his advocacy for the creation of the International AntiCorruption Court. Judge Wolf, thanks for being with us today.
Dan, thank you very much for having me.
Sure. Tell us, where did the idea for an International Anti-Corruption Court come from?
Well, it's really rooted in my biography, which you recited in some pertinent parts. Shortly before President Nixon resigned in 1974, I was an assistant to Lawrence Silberman, the Deputy Attorney General of the United States, and then for 2 years in the Ford administration, an assistant to Attorney General Edward Levy. So as a very young lawyer, I was introduced to the issue of how do you hold the highest officials in a democracy or any country accountable for criminal conduct. 5 years later, I was the chief federal public corruption prosecutor in Massachusetts. And after we won 45 consecutive cases, I was appointed a United States district judge. And that experience is particularly important to the court because in the United States, we don't prosecute corrupt state and local officials in state courts. They don't have the right laws. They don't have the capacity to do complex financial investigations, and the prosecutors are elected, not appointed by the president, as U.S. attorneys are. So I was going around the world after I became a judge to many countries, usually at the invitation of ambassadors. I went to Egypt, Turkey, China, Slovakia for Ambassador Todd Sedgwick, Czech Republic, Romania, and ultimately to Russia. And what I realized is that these were countries ruled by kleptocrats, corrupt leaders. They were the worst abusers of human rights. All of these countries were parties to the UN Convention Against Corruption. They all had laws making bribery and misappropriation of public resources illegal. But these people, these kleptocrats, had impunity in their own countries because they controlled the police, the prosecutors, and the courts. So I realized that what was needed was the counterpart to the federal courts in the United States, and that is the International AntiCorruption Court.
What would an International Anti-Corruption Court accomplish, and how would it function?
So the International Anti-Corruption Court would be a fair forum to prosecute and, if convicted, imprison kleptocrats who have impunity in their own countries, countries that are unwilling to prosecute their corrupt leaders. Russia epitomizes that. Or unable, a country like Moldova that has a long history of grand corruption, now has an honest president, but does not now have the capacity to do major cases itself. And this would create the opportunity. The successful prosecution and imprisonment of a kleptocrat would create the opportunity, not the certainty, but the opportunity for the democratic process to replace that corrupt leader with someone dedicated to serving his or her citizens rather than enriching himself, herself. Very importantly, this would be a preventive measure. It would deter other kleptocrats. Corruption is a crime of calculation. The money is there. The kleptocrats can steal it. There's not going to be any adverse consequence. The credible threat that they're going to go to prison for committing these crimes would diminish grand corruption, and it would also result in the recovery and repatriation of illicit assets to the countries that have been victimized and often looted. With regard to functioning, the court would have jurisdiction to prosecute high officials of countries and those who conspire with them, the enablers, the money launderers, the bankers, the lawyers, the real estate agents, and the people who pay bribes, importantly. The court would be a court of last resort. It would operate on the principle of complementarity. So it would only prosecute officials and their co-conspirators, but officials of countries that, as I said, are unwilling or unable to prosecute themselves. It would be a place where evidence developed by courageous investigative journalists and whistleblowers could be used, and that doesn't exist now. So that are the fundamentals of the way the court would function.
I get the sense, Judge, that there are some criticisms in the U.S. You listed all the progressive countries, Canada, the Netherlands. I noticed you didn't have the United States. What are the criticisms of the United States? Because I think that's the elephant in the room.
Well, I'll address the U.S. criticisms, but it would be helpful, I think, if I put it in the context of the criticisms even more generally. A common criticism is, well, countries ruled by kleptocrats won't join the court. The answer to that is they don't have to. It's axiomatic that kleptocrats don't want to keep their illicit assets in their own country. The International Consortium of Investigative Journalists in the Panama Papers provided overwhelming evidence that Putin has laundered hundreds of millions of dollars or more through and into Switzerland. That means he's committed the crime of money laundering in Switzerland. If some of that went to London to be near the riches of his oligarch friends, he's also committed the crime of money laundering in the UK. So if Switzerland or the UK, which is a very promising prospect, as I can explain, join the court but don't want to prosecute Putin themselves, he could be prosecuted in the International AntiCorruption Court. I think a major criticism in the United States is that this would be an incursion on our national sovereignty. And it's true that any country around the world that joins the court is agreeing to share some of its sovereignty. However, the United States would have nothing to fear from an International AntiCorruption Court. As I said, the court would operate on the principle of complementarity. And only countries that are unwilling or unable to prosecute their highest officials would be subject to prosecution in the IACC. There's probably no country in the world, except perhaps Israel, but no country in the world that does better in prosecuting its highest officials than the United States. We're prosecuting former President Trump now. We're prosecuting Senator Menendez. So the theoretical concern that might be more real with regard to a court like the International Criminal Court should not be a serious concern for anyone in the United States. Another criticism sometimes is that the International Criminal Court is not worthy of emulation. It's focused too much on African countries, hasn't been productive or cost efficient. But we've learned a lot of lessons from the ICC. It's expensive. It costs about $168 million a year. But we think we're designing a court that would cost much, much less, perhaps as little as $60 million a year, could be paid for by fines, convicted kleptocrats, and in any event, by deterring kleptocracy, would save huge sums of money. And there would be no reason for the court to focus primarily or exclusively on Africa. The crimes within the jurisdiction of the ICC have been largely committed in Africa, but grand corruption occurs around the world. The earlier most common criticism of the court was, this is a very compelling idea, but it's an impossible ideal. That criticism has been muted recently. As you mentioned, more than 300 world leaders have endorsed creation of this court. That includes more than 50 former presidents and prime ministers. The European Parliament has endorsed the court. Countries such as the Netherlands, Canada, Nigeria, Moldova, Ecuador have endorsed it recently. Colombia was the first country to endorse the court. Many others have privately endorsed it. And indeed, I mentioned the UK. The Labour Party in the UK, which is expected to win the parliamentary elections this year, has endorsed the court. And Foreign Minister Cameron in the UK, in the Tory government now, has indicated that the Tories are going to seriously consider doing this. And in fact, I may be going to London to meet with him to discuss that as of a conversation yesterday. So essentially, those are the criticisms and the responses to them.
Make the case as to why this would be a bipartisan win here in the United States.
Yeah, bipartisan, and we might even say nonpartisan. Grand corruption is a major cause of many of the greatest world problems and a major impediment to ameliorating. The refugees who are creating a humanitarian crisis and a crisis in many other ways in the United States are fleeing from failed, corrupt states, states ruled by kleptocrats. And the best efforts of the United States to get the Guatemalas of the world to combat corruption and diminish the reasons that their people would make dangerous trips to our borders is this grand corruption. It also relates to the epidemic of deadly drugs in the United States. The kleptocrats throughout Latin America are largely in partnership with the drug cartels. And if we want to diminish drug trafficking, particularly of things like deadly fentanyl, we have to get indigenous governments and their leaders to genuinely fight those traffickers themselves. Climate is a major issue. There's the Green Climate Fund, which is supposed to disperse $100 billion a year to countries throughout the world to mitigate climate change and its adverse effects. By the best estimates, about 42% of that will go to some of the most corrupt countries in the world, ruled by kleptocrats. The Green Climate Fund barely has an auditing function. It has no enforcement function. My colleagues and I predicted that a large amount of the money that was distributed very quickly to combat COVID would be stolen by kleptocrats with impunity. That happened, and I can predict that the same thing will happen with the Green Climate Fund money. The United States has made many efforts to promote democracy and combat autocracy around the world. It's important. But after hearing me speak on the BBC Hard Talk program, the former president of Iraq contacted me and said, I want to become your partner in this venture. The United States doesn't understand how much of the billions of dollars it's spent in Afghanistan and Iraq has been lost to grand corruption, how many American soldiers have died because of that, and how it undermines every effort to promote democracy in our countries. And I keep going back to Russia because I am passionately concerned about Ukraine, but it's a grave threat to international peace and security. One of the two causes of the Revolution of Dignity in 2014, the Maidan Revolution, was indignation at then-President Yanukovych's corruption. And he was in a long line of corrupt Ukrainian leaders. He flees to Russia. Russia goes into Crimea. And now we have the full-scale illegal invasion, crime of aggression by Putin, that might not have occurred if there wasn't that upheaval. And actually, another reason it should be bipartisan, the International Anti-Corruption Court will be very good for American businesses. They tend to be honest. In any event, they've been about the only multinational companies that have faced the threat of prosecution under our federal Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. This would level the playing field. So the United States historically has been a leader in combating corruption internationally. That FCPA, which came after Watergate as a result of Watergate, has been enacted in counterparts in 42 other countries that don't enforce it, with one exception maybe. We should continue to be a leader.
What are the benefits of an international anti-corruption court in the context of international economic development? I've always thought that corruption is a big global bad and has all sorts of distortive effects on investment and economic development. How do you see it, Judge?
Yeah, the question is, as I understand it, what are the economic implications, the implications for economic development? The best estimates, most authoritative estimates, are that 10 times more is lost to corruption in developing countries than they receive in foreign aid. Everything we and other international donors try to do is essentially wiped out by corruption. And if you want to change an endemic culture of corruption in a country, it needs to be changed from the top. You've got a background in international development. You've got experience in U.S. aid. But all of those efforts, important efforts, are undermined by this corruption. And it's a transnational problem. It requires a transnational institution, among other things, to effectively address it.
You talked a little bit about Ukraine, but let me come back to that. How should we think about the International Anti-Corruption Court in the context of what's on the front page of the newspaper right now, which is Israel and Ukraine?
Yes. So with regard to Ukraine, where I and my colleagues have been deeply involved for a number of years, I played a role in helping establish its special national anti-corruption court. Ukraine has a history of endemic corruption, including in the judiciary. It's created special investigative prosecutors in courts for corruption. But those courts are not yet mature enough, strong enough to do major cases against high-level officials and oligarchs. And officials who are leaders of those institutions have said they would benefit greatly from the International Anti-Corruption Court. And indeed, I met with the ambassador from Ukraine to the UN the day after Christmas to discuss Ukrainian support. The Ukrainian government has to do a much better job in combating corruption because their citizens demand it. They're not just fighting Russia to maintain independence. They want democracy, and corruption is inconsistent with democracy. They're going to not tolerate it in the future the way they may have tolerated it in the past. Fighting corruption and demonstrating a determination to fight corruption is essential to maintaining that crucial international aid in this war against Russia. Corruption is either a reason or an excuse for countries or people in countries not to want to provide that vital aid. And demonstrating a long-term commitment to combating corruption through supporting the International Anti-Corruption Court should help Ukraine on that. And corruption is one of the major impediments, one of the major issues in the effort to get into the EU. So there are many, I would say, compelling reasons for Ukraine to back this, and we're in conversations about that. I was on the lawn at the White House in 1993, I think it was, when Rabin and Arafat shook hands. It was a very hopeful time. And there was a lot of serious discussion about resolving the violence in the ensuing years. But the Palestinian Authority proved to be totally corrupt, and Hamas is too. Interestingly, on October 6th, the day before the invasion, the Palestinian-born dean of the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs released a poll of the West Bank and Gaza. And the poll showed that the most important issue for people on the West Bank and Gaza shortly before October 6th was corruption. It wasn't Israel. It was the corruption of the Palestinian Authority. It was the corruption of Hamas. There's tremendous discussion now, there has to be, about what happens when Israel withdraws from Gaza, and renewed discussion about the value of a two-state solution where two countries would coexist peacefully. But there hasn't been really ever an honest representative of the Palestinians, who are victimized, in my view, by their leaders. There hasn't been an honest interlocutor for the Israelis, honest and one with the legitimacy to, in the interest, to speak for the true interests of the Palestinian people. The Washington Post has reported that the leaders of Hamas who live in Qatar and elsewhere are billionaires because they've been siphoning off funds that are supposed to serve the people. So, in my view, the Palestinian people are particular victims of corruption. And until there's an honest representative, legitimate representative of the Palestinian people, this is going to be an intractable dilemma.
I agree. Well, Judge, thank you for coming on today. This was just phenomenal. Really, really interesting. If people want to learn more about the International AntiCorruption Court, where can they go to learn more about it, Judge?
Well, as you said, I'm the chair of Integrity Initiatives International. Our website is integrityinitiatives.org, integrityinitiatives.org. There's another website dedicated exclusively to the International AntiCorruption Court, which is more in evolution. But on our website, there's a means to write to us, and we would be very pleased to hear from anybody who's listened to this podcast. So I thank you for the opportunity to participate.
Well, thanks, Judge. It's been a pleasure. I really appreciate you taking the time. Thanks very much.
Thank you again.
If you enjoyed this podcast, check out our larger suite of CSIS podcasts. From Into Africa, The Asia Chessboard, China Power, AIDS 2020, The Trade Guys, Smart Women, Smart Power, and more. You can listen to them all on major streaming platforms like iTunes and Spotify. Visit csis.org/podcasts to see our full catalog